interests. Take, for example, the food conglomerate Cargill, who have invested in Regrow. The US offers immense opportunities for climate tech and smart cities businesses, both in the public and private sectors. That said, it is also highly competitive and a complex market to navigate. And so we're very grateful to have Anastasia, founder of Regrow, sharing her insights and experiences today. So without further ado, over to you, Mick and Anastasia. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Lasia and Charlotte. I really appreciate it and want to have New South Wales government support. Anastasia, great to be connecting with you yet again. Been wonderful to see your journey as an entrepreneur and the company really taking off. And you're joining us from LA today. I know you've been traveling around the world a lot, but you're in your home base in LA.
That's it.
We've shared a fair bit with everybody about Regrow and the history, but just to again bring everyone up to speed, and also given we've got to focus on taking these companies global, there's a lot to explore here. But I'd love to hear the really quick life story of Regrow, if you can. I know that could take a whole hour in itself, but just the quick highlights and where we got to today, with particular focus, I guess, on the US market.
All right, awesome. Let's do this. First of all, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And so great to see familiar names and familiar faces. I wish you all success with scaling to the international markets, and hopefully I'll be helpful to you today in some regard. A quick introduction to Regrow. It is a climate-first ag tech company, or a climate technology startup scale-up. We were born in Sydney. We went through a number of accelerators there, of which actually Mick was a part of. So he was pretty much one of the our first few series startup people that I pitched to. And we had the fortune of being based in Sakata Innovations and getting that support. There was a lot of support from Investment New South Wales, or from New South Wales as a kind of business hub for us to mature our technology. We've raised the kind of early round from institutional investors and customers in Australia. Then Australia actually hit drought, and we were forced to find a way to continue and scale our business, which seemed logical to be US expansion. Having landed the customers in the US, we raised seed 2 that was led by Microsoft. And just before that, we completed an acquisition of a company technology in Australia. Past that seed 2, we raised the Series A last August. That was co-led by Cargill. And most recently, something like 7 days ago, we announced a Series B led by one of the biggest climate investors, with a wonderful fund, Galvanize, that brings us all in all over $60 million in funding. And we had a second acquisition also that I forgot to mention. So there was building companies, building technology, getting customer traction, and getting investment on the back of that. That's kind of the B.
It's a pretty amazing journey. One thing we've got a lot of entrepreneurs on the call, and one thing I'd like to really dig into is the starting vision and how it evolved. So I know the company name changed, but that's probably one of the easiest things to change. You began with a bold vision. It was one of the things that I think gave you lots of support, attracted good people to you, and one of the things that certainly impressed me. Can you tell me about how you got that? Like, was that just natural to you to think about a global vision? You always wanted to build something big, or was there a particular push to help you go and have that bigger ambition? And I'd also love to hear about how that evolved over time.
I guess I have the advantage of being the international founder that I am. And to me, global is the first preference, given I'm a global citizen. So I couldn't really imagine doing the business just in one country and kind of being constrained by that. And I think the fact that we're in the food business and climate technology is also pretty applicable cross-border. So I feel like there's definitely always a question of how big is your total addressable market, and if that doesn't include the global footprint, if you're a vertical solution, you're really limiting yourselves. But of course, that wasn't what I was thinking when I was starting this company that was back then called Fireside. I was just really thinking about the fact that I am passionate about solving a problem, and the problem is the environmental damage and the risks on the overall food production that the current conventional system of agriculture inflicts. And I've been in it with the same problem, with the same set of solutions for the 5-6 years. Of course, the solutions have evolved and built on each other, and with those acquisitions, they become more complete. But I think it's really important what even the startup coaches were saying at the very beginning. I really see how that differentiates us from competition that has actually died along the way as we were persevering and building, and were even offered to acquire them. It was the differentiation between being in love with the problem and being in love with the solution. If you're in love with a hammer, you're just looking for a nail, and that is never going to get you there. If you're in love with the existential crisis-like problem solving, like you're really passionate about solving it, I think that is what really is important to drive that attractiveness of the solution, and for you to be forced to consider to do things differently. It still applies, like do what doesn't scale. When you first time do it as a founder, do it as your founding team or as your core team, for sure. We still have to do it, even at Series B, like we're still inventing new solutions. But I think if we just looked at our mandate of like, we have this cool technology, we want to apply it everywhere, it wouldn't have led to actually something that is so attractive to the market and the customers. So that's, I think, what differentiates us. And I think the global perspective versus a local perspective is something that people need to kind of find their inner inspiration for, whether you need to visit that market and really get inspired, or, look at some numbers. Everyone gets that drive differently. For me, I'm Ukrainian who lived and studied in 7 to 8 countries, depending on how you count. I currently live in the US. This is the market that suits my pace and that is ready to invest in the problem I want to solve. And the path to here was through effectively R&D in Australia that now we are exporting, which is fantastic. So that's how I got here. I'm not necessarily saying everyone will get here this way, but I think what Mick is sharing is there's a dependency between how big is your vision and what kind of support you attract. And I think if you are looking at something very niche that can be boxed into a lifestyle business, you really don't want that. Like you really want to see clearly what is your ambition and align that with a group of supporters. I'm not saying lifestyle businesses are not great. It's just this is not a startup, but this is a lifestyle business, and those things are different.
So you're very international citizen. I didn't know all the study globally, but can you talk about in terms of building locally and selling globally? There's obviously for pure software, it's a bit easier to build in Australia and sell it online just by changing currency perhaps and a couple of Zs instead of Ss for the US. But obviously for your product, it was a lot more complicated. And you mentioned in your intro that you kind of got interest initially from customers and some support, but then there was a drought that forced you international. Can you talk a bit about that change and what's the same and what's different about Australia and the world and the rest of the world?
Yeah, and I think it's a couple of things. Like when we started focused on this problem of like, how do we get agronomists or crop doctors better information, because they seem to be key to farmers making decisions differently, which as a cascade would result in better environmental impact of agriculture. We understood that whole model is very seasonal, and to be a less seasonal business, but to be around the year-round, round-the-clock business that can withstand the challenges, it meant we had what was called back then a 2-hemisphere plan. So when ag tech emerged, when it was the baby category, when we were all talking and there was only 10 of us across the globe, people went to Latin America, or we went to the US, and we kind of all met each other. And there was this saying of like, ag tech needs a double hemisphere plan. So part of that is the logic of like, what is the kind of business you want to have? And if that is a business with a recurring revenue and subscriptions, that means it cannot have 6 months up and 6 months down periods, or maybe, more like 9 and 3, but still that's something that was affecting the way that investors perceived fluorescein as. And Mike Zimmerman, who I absolutely adore, and he's still on my board, and he challenged me back then. He said, two things that have really shaped since those early days our success. One thing was, Anastasia, it seems like you're pushing into the market. Can you figure out how to make it pull? Like, can you figure out what could make you indispensable? And that is how we made the acquisitions and attached ourselves kind of to a compliance sustainability claim that everyone's making now. It's the same change on the farm, but it's a different motivation. It's a different funding mechanism. So that advice of like, are you a vitamin or painkiller was given to me through, can you try to figure out how to get into a place where the market will pull you as opposed to you will push? And I think that's one advice that connects to your question, why US? Because I felt that US was actually pulling these solutions more. In Australia, you had to push more into the market for various reasons, because our customers at the time were in agri food, kind of upstream, very close to the farmer, and they didn't have a lot of subsidies to spare. Like in the US, they have a little bit of a buffer and they can actually invest in technology. So it's a different perspective. Every market is different. And kind of the second piece of advice, one again was around specifically focus on what will pull you. And the other piece was, how can you increase the learning per unit time back to, this is like a 6 months on, 6 months off. Why are we not experimenting? We need to be constantly learning and iterating. If you only get one shot at it a year, look at all the SaaS businesses that can iterate and change something every day. Of course, we're not that, but we still figured out how with a multi-hemisphere plan, and actually it's not just that, like when you're in agriculture, you realize that Brazil has 3 seasons as opposed to 2 seasons like the rest of the world. So there's more nuance to it. Ultimately, it ends up with, if you're really passionate about growing a big business, it does mean that you need to iterate on the business model and the solution, find the market that will work with you on it. So we actually found New Zealand was more receptive because of the sustainability aspect. So we got that early traction through the acquisition of the first technology in Australia. They started pulling us into the sustainability space and how much they cared about it. And in the US, we discovered that the reception was actually pretty positive to what we were doing, more positive than in Australia. So to us, Australia, to me, and agri-food, and maybe I'll generalize and get some heat for that afterwards, but I've seen European market, American market, and Australian market pretty close up, and I can tell that I love Europe. I'm European. I'm half European, half Australian now through assimilation. But Europe is very conservative, is very grant driven. It's not very much for a private business. America is the opposite of that. Australia is somewhere in between, where the government is trying to be helpful, but the private business hasn't developed that full control as it has in the US, and it's still an oligopoly. There's 4 of everything, like 3 or 4 of banks, of consultant, like major consultants, of everything. So you kind of still have this small market effect. What that does is that you don't necessarily get a lot of competition between companies that want to compete by using you as an innovation. That to us meant a lot. And we've picked up on this trend that if you go to the US and get picked up, you can then actually come back to Australia pretty gloriously, because people have seen you as a proven choice of solutions. And to us, food and ag is headquartered across the US and Europe. So anchoring there and going back out to regional markets, of which Australia is one of them, was inevitable. We wouldn't have never gotten to a headquarters through Australian pathway. We needed to go straight to the source. So again, I'm trying to give you the parameters and variables that inform these decisions as well, so you can all think about how your parameters and variables change that thinking of where you need to be and how you need to approach.
Yeah, I think it's great advice around the experimentation. I think certainly sometimes it's easier to think that you can't experiment because of outside forces, but I think with some creativity, there are good ways to find good ways to experiment. I want to quickly take you back, if you can, to that time before you actually went international, and maybe your first trip. There's a lot of entrepreneurs here are perhaps getting ready to take their companies for the first time, and it can be quite nerve-wracking to think all I've got is a vision and maybe an MVP, or maybe I've got a few customers in Australia. What's something that what can you share about your experience about maybe your first trip to the US, about building contacts and getting, like, did you start by finding investors and then build a team, get customers? Did you get customers, then get a team? Did you do it all remote? Did you travel there? You're living there now. Can you tell a bit about the early days and how that evolved?
For sure. I think if someone doesn't have customers in Australia and there's no good explanation as to why you don't have customers in Australia, that's the first problem to solve. Because like if you're afraid of getting out there and actually getting customer traction, that is a big problem. If you were using an excuse such as like, oh, here the market is just more conservative. Whilst that might be true, you should be able to find the outliers that are not as conservative. At least, again, take it all with a grain of salt of a person who shares a subjective point of view. We were able to do that, and that was really important for us. And we always do customers with a little bit of a delay, team, and after that, investors. That's how we always have done it. And this is how, if you stack the dominoes that way, you really get good coverage. It's not, some people do it the other way around. Some people also sit in stealth for a long time. But I believe in getting out there and working with the customer and really following the startup Bible of like, find the 30 people that really hit your ideal perfect profile of a customer and go and talk to them, show them your solution. And once you've done that, once you've had those meetings, understand what they're saying and really be open. Like instead of, building them a better hammer, you really need to understand what is a problem that they want you to solve. Because how to not feel that this is so nerve-wracking to actually go and expose yourself to all these people and reach out to them and feel like you're selling to them. It's actually be genuinely curious. Like, I want to solve problems for people in food and agriculture. And to me, that means that I want to reach out to sustainability professionals, to agronomists, to farmers, and hear what are the blockers for them to change the way they invest in soil health and in their farms, and how they, make applications of different like fertilizer or whatever. That means that I can reach out to any of them. And right now, of course, I have, you can say like the accolades, etc. But I am the person, and Mick knows this and can like testify. I'm the one who onboarded all of the first customers, all of the big ones, all of them. Like, I had to do what doesn't scale, of course, with a big team support now, but the original 30 agronomists, I did that. I was in the pickup truck. I was there. Same thing happened in the US. And it's important that you actually develop that empathy, but being alongside them, trying to meet them. And I think if you come from that perspective, people really open up and they want to talk to you. They're not going to say, oh, what are you doing here trying to sell me something? Like, it depends on what questions you're asking. And the questions should not be, why don't you like my solution? They should be like, I'm passionate about solving this problem. It seems like you resonate with that problem. Would you have time for me to really share with me how you're currently solving it? How should I be thinking about it? Is that something that you would like to devote your time to solving? If they're saying no to that, it means that they're not going to give you money either, because it actually is the same thing. You commit time and then you commit money. And so if this is not important for them, is it a different persona you should be targeting? Or is it something that is not actually on the high list of the problems? And in that case, are you actually going to get the budget from that type of business? So I don't want to like get everyone to be thinking about existential things here, but the difference between having more product market fit and not having product market fit is like, being high all the time and being in depression all the time. That's kind of the difference for me as an entrepreneur. So like, I would give it all you can in finding that as quickly as possible.
That's a great analogy. I haven't heard that one. I do love the domino, the customers, then wait a bit, then team, then wait a bit, then investors. I think you have done that. And I think it's easy to read the AFR article and go, wow, she's just done amazingly. Everything's come to her naturally and easily and a success. But absolutely, Anastasia has done, I think, it was back, when did you start Regrow or Fireside?
Yeah, 2016, November.
2016, yeah. So it's a 6-year journey with lots of work, and Anastasia has done that work to build it up. One thing I'd like to dig into, because obviously you got lots of different feedback and inputs from mentors and investors, advisors and customers. Did you have a framework for processing that? Because one of the hardest things is all the information doesn't point to one clear signal simple signal, right? You get lots of different information, and some of it says keep doing what you're doing, some of it says pivot, some of it says throw it all in, it's never going to work. How did you process all that and decide what to experiment on, and what to prioritize?
Oh my gosh, I wish I could tell you like I'm this analytical human who has this system and this is how I do it, but this is actually, it's like, no, I have this thing called gut feel. Joking. It's somewhere between those things of like everything you read in the books, how you build relationships with people, and to me, it's who you trust. And I really selected the people I trusted based on the expertise of them doing something very similar to what I wanted to succeed in. That's my way of understanding whose feedback I should prioritize. That's why we're so selective about who are the customers we onboard, because we'll be listening to them. And I don't necessarily want the team to have the customers that we shouldn't really be solving the problems for because they're in the wrong category or it doesn't translate to the rest of the customer group. Same applies for investors. If you look at someone, look at their background, and you can say, okay, this person has done what I want to do, then my decision, and I'm not writing the manual how everyone needs to do it, but this is how I do it. I say, okay, if I see that pattern, I trust that person to do that. And especially if I see the pattern of that translated into different verticals or having done that a couple of times, ideally having done that themselves and having helped someone to do it. That is my ideal situation. Not every founder can find another founder operator who became an investor who has that type of experience. I was really lucky that I have found that, and then I supplemented that with other investors who had more diverse perspectives that was lacking of this kind of core person, more around like right now what's most important, what you can see reflected in the Series B, is the scaling. So we have found for us the best investor who really understands how to scale companies like us, how to take them to X amount in revenue, X number in people, how to make them, help them be successful. And I understand that it's going to hurt and it's going to be very hard because every time you change and scale, you have to admit all the things you don't do that great. And frankly, I do it up front. Like no one shows up to the first board meeting post investment and they're like, oh, I thought. It's like, no. Like you are here being recruited to help us do these 10 things that we don't do that great. And if you think that is okay, if you are okay with that, and if you want to do that job with us, come and do that job with us. And by the way, can you tell me the other 2 times that you've done that? So I can also get some confirmation that you're the right person I should be listening to. That's kind of my way of processing feedback, seeing if people have actually applied it and delivered on that advice themselves or someone who they've mentored done that.
Yeah, that's a really great way to put it. You mentioned a few things there. I also want to dig into some more about building relationships with people. Certainly with investors. And one thing I see far too much is people, again, read your articles about your capital raise and they kind of think maybe you went into a room and did a pitch and then someone writes you a check and you walk out with a check. So 2 things I'd like to dig into is the time scale by which you build relationships before the investment, and also you have from absolute day one, just what you touched on then, you've been ambitious but brutally honest. So you're honest about how hard it's going to be and the challenges and the work to be done, but you have big ambition and you're very direct with people about that. I think people think there's got to be this perfect pitch which just I don't know how it happens like magic. But can you talk a bit more about that that transparency and relationship building and maybe some stories about how you've done that with investors?
Yeah, and I think what Mick is really trying to get at is a question of value add. Like why are you looking for investment? Just because you want to get more cash? Well, sorry.
Anastasia, I lost your audio for a second.
Was unhappy.
Oh,
sorry.
Hey.
Yeah,
we're
back. Sorry. Yeah, didn't say anything insightful, so I'll do it again. Basically, what Mick's trying to get at is the concept of value add, and I think it's really important. And investor relationships are those that, to me, I can get access to people who I can't hire to work with me on the business. How can I get them to contribute to what I'm doing? I need to figure out what their strengths and weaknesses are and describe to them the best I can what I need to get done, what I don't feel fully qualified to do, or where I feel like I need support. And of course, you can say, okay, here are all the 100 things. So, like, really, what does your business need to be great at? What is important at this stage? Like, what should take you to the next stage? And maybe the right investor is to help you figure that out in the first place. Like, maybe you don't necessarily know what you need to figure out between now and the next stage, or advisor, or other founders you can connect with who are just at the next stage from where you are. So I think, Mick, to your question as to how to build that transparency and how to build relationships, what's the time frame to do that, I think it's important to build relationships because you're on the constant journey of, like, you're permanently passionate about what you're doing, and you're permanently, it should be, interested in meeting people who are potentially good at solving the problems that you need to be solved. Ideally, the time to build those relationships, and I'm sure everyone's heard this so many times, is not when you actually need to capital raise. Is as soon, the best time is when you just raised, frankly. But then it's also might seem very awkward, but then it turns out not to be when you actually do this a couple of times. So I think with investors and their expectations of the best investors that I know is really for the founder to be coachable and to be able to say, here are the things I need your help with amongst all of you, or particularly for you. Like, are any of the things something you can help me with? And what I've heard from the best investors, that this is how they like their founders managing that relationship as well. So I think there's a lot to be said in how to build and manage that relationship transparently, so that if you are genuinely seeing that is a person who can lend you experience in building at this current stage, why wouldn't you be going to them for advice? And Mick Liubinskas famously taught all the startups that he interacted with that you need money, go for advice. You ask for advice, you get money. Golden rule, absolutely works. It's just that the timing that you need to be very careful of. That's the only thing that I've learned in addition to that advice.
Yeah. That's a good point. Definitely is true, and still working on giving people that experience. It is the other joke we say, which is you start capital raising with a hangover because you just closed your last round. Now that's easy to say because some people are just trying to close their first round, but it absolutely is about relationships. And again, one thing you've done is you've actually made what people want to be a part of Fluorosat and Regrow, rather than be like you going out asking for investment. You've made Fluorosat and Regrow attractive, that people want to be a part of it, not the other way around. We've got a question.
Mick, and I would like to kind of add to that, because I didn't think I mentioned this particular point, like, how do you do that at the very early stage? I think it's important to build that network, and that's partly, I think, what Mick's trying to do with Climate Salad, and like generally there's other places to try to build that network of entrepreneurs. It can be an incubator like Cicada, etc., where they're connected to some of the best advisors. Like if you're connected to Mick is connected to a lot of investors who know really well his past career and his choices and preferences, and can support the companies that he sees as being very attractive, just as one of the examples as to how you leverage advisor and then investor and then so on and so on. I think the general rule that we try to apply is every extra person or every new investor has to add that much more for us to really get to the next level, to be able to reach further and further and further. And like that's I think what makes for a great progression, because everyone really enjoys to be a part of that story, and our previous investors really enjoy interacting with our new investors. And it kind of, or same works for customers, same works for the team. Like, how can you go for each next decision and each next relationship, whether it's a hire, a customer contract, a relationship, or an investor relationship, to be a building off of everything you've done so far, and assuming you know where you're building, what you're building towards.
It touches on a really valuable other topic, which is the focus area of CEOs, the focus of the work. And to begin with, you're doing a little bit of everything. Certainly, as you start entering international markets and raising capital and building a team around you, you, as you said, you may not be driving the utility truck out and going to speak to an agronomist every day, but can you tell us a bit about how your role as a CEO and leader has changed over the evolution of Regrow?
I think the first answer is like aggressively. Like that's how it has changed. The fact that it changes every quarter of every 6 months significantly for me to palpably experience the change is, I think, one of the results of the high growth. Like that's what's called high growth, when like your job changes so much and your direct reports, their job changes, and so on and so forth, kind of propagates through the company. I'm not saying we're building new product, but I'm saying I need to get better at new things. As a Series B CEO, I need to be that much better at my professional performance, at coaching my direct reports, at delegating and actually giving room and balancing the motivation with the performance focus of the company, the big vision with the delivery. And I think it's a lot more verbally focused than it used to be, a lot more hands-on focused when we were a lot smaller, and I had to do a lot of things, had a chance to do a lot of them myself. And I'm not going to pretend that I was good at all of them. Like I was not good at managing the science team because my level of patience and eagerness to realize something is not conducive to managing science experiments, even if it's still in software. This is one's off. So I think early on, understanding who's better suited to manage that, I've given Kelly Champavier, our brilliant head of product, the product reins, what is now like 4 years ago. And so that's been a brilliant journey. I'm still very involved in product strategy and helping us build good product portfolio that fits our vision. I'm still a product first CEO, because that's where the solution for the customers is coming from. And I constantly evolve what is seen kind of in the opposite of the rear view mirror, like on the horizon, far on the horizon. That's kind of where my product work focus is, and then maybe kind of midterm. But I do a lot less of that. I think I would encourage folks to think that a CEO always does the selling of the company to the new hires, to investors. So I don't think, and I've generally gotten feedback like that from other investors, just generally talking about their experience, that they really don't understand how other CEOs try to kind of outsource the fundraising, because you are really bringing people on board with your journey and you're giving up part of your company, or hiring, especially in the early stages. Later on, of course, you can afford for your team to be hiring, but that is so far down the track when you already have like 80 to 100 people, like what we have now. Now we have a head of talent, and I still like to support my direct reports in their hiring and just in coming in and selling why someone should leave their big tech company and come and work at Regrow, although became much more self-explanatory in the recent years with the climate crisis. But that's, I think, how the role changes. The focus changes, what you say changes, how you need to show up. Importantly, how people perceive you changes a lot. Your words when you're a baby company is one thing. Your words when you are on, in front of everyone and raising bigger amounts of money and getting a bigger ambition to support global brands, it's something different. And your team perceives you differently. And sometimes it means you can't afford anymore to do the minutia, because if you do that you're seen as wasteful to your time that can be spent strategically. And that's a realization that I think every successful CEO at some point had to make. But I think it's important to focus on the things that truly should not be outsourced until the last moment, and that they are around sales and hiring and raising investment, to me.
Is there anything you touched on a few things in there in terms of hiring your first key people and how that grows and evolves? Can you was there anything particular around creating the culture that you did that really worked for you? And again, not to say it's prescriptive for everybody, but was there a particular kind of activity or a mantra or what did you do to build that strong early culture?
I think I'll start by saying I did about 15 things that didn't work and almost broke me and my heart and my life. Like that, it was the first 2 years. And after that, it got better. because we actually established somewhat of an industry, somewhat of attraction with customers and investors. But before, hiring just felt like completely the most difficult activity I could possibly imagine. There was nobody to hire from, nobody actually commercialized this type of technology, and I was not the right manager for the really nitty-gritty stuff that needed to get done. And we got through it, but I wouldn't say it was happy days. And I felt like I was not in the place where I belonged. Like that was challenging, because as an entrepreneur, I'm motivated by two things, and it's personal. One is by the impact and the fact that I am high functioning human being. I want to devote my working hours to something I really care about. And the second thing, I want to be doing it with the people that I feel are my people, that are aligned with that goal, that are going to, give the wake time and hours of their days to the problem that we're all collectively passionate about. It is so rewarding. And I think getting to that was a journey of the first kind of 2-3 years of the company, because it is the whole turmoil around, if you don't get attraction, people will not join you. And also in early days, you didn't even understand who are the people who should work for you, who would work with you. So I think the element that was consistent around it was that I try to be as transparent and direct. I think the element that was variable is stress levels and maturity of me as a founder and CEO. And I think there was a lot higher levels of stress and lower levels of maturity at the beginning that really get you into not your best behavior. And it's, I think, normal for all the founders to experience that in some way, to either want to quit it or really feel disappointed or feel angry. Like all of us are not in our best behavior and show it in some kind of way. And I think I'm sharing that because I don't want people to feel like everyone's going to get to this point and glamorously emerges, without any scratches. Like, no, we have scratches and burns and bruises, and not just me, a lot of people, unfortunately. But I think having built a little bit more of that industry and understanding of what this technology vertical does, having worked with many people and try to kind of bring them on the journey, you do work out what kind of people do you need. And I think, Mick, one of the things for us was the fact that Australia just didn't have those people back then. Like they didn't exist. Like, it's not like I couldn't find them, that I couldn't groom them, train them, they didn't exist. And then going to the US, there was actually a little bit more of that activity, a little bit more of ag tech, people who've done their first and second ag tech startup. You could actually attract that talent. And then it started feeling like, okay, this feels like I'm in my kind of corner of the world now. And I think culturally, what has worked is that direct transparency and other things were coded into company values and into company kind of code of operating. And I think that's what people now cite as, teamwork over individual performance. At the same time, it's balanced with impact, with efficiency and ownership. So it's, we're really impact oriented, and we want to treat all resources like our own, but we do want to do this together, because none of us has the right answer on our own. When it comes down to it, we're all ready to take the ownership. So I think it got coded into company values, and through all of this learning, we became and are able to afford, frankly, now to be a lot more transparent as to who are the people who would work at Regrow. Like, we need fairly senior people who would roll up their sleeves. We still cannot afford a lot of junior people, because our capacity to execute and grow per unit time is just so big. So all of those things are, you kind of learn who you can give a good experience in this company, and that is a learning in its own right, culturally as well as functionally.
Yeah, absolutely. You touched on impact there, and William's got a question in the chat, which is about Regrow's timing and ambition, perhaps, to go into the smallholder producers, let's say in Africa and Southeast Asia. We know that there's massive smallholder opportunities in the world, but they're can be much more challenging to reach. Is that a part of your roadmap?
Yeah, so we're actually tackling it in a particular way. So we've raised the ground from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I believe last year, to spearhead our work around sub-Saharan Africa and adapting our technology to sub-Saharan Africa. So it's partly grant funded because we couldn't invent a business model that would work out of the box there. So that same approach and that same kind of paradigm would apply to other smallholder farming communities. We actually do have users on the platform out of India, Vietnam, Sri Lanka. Like we do operate in those countries. Luckily, what we're seeing is in terms of the regenerative agriculture, there is it looks like there's going to be a pickup of like basically some philanthropic funding to accelerate the adoption and availability of such solutions in those markets as well. And I'm not saying as an entrepreneur, like I can just sit and rely on it, but I think easing that entry point would be very valuable. I was in India a couple of times before COVID, and would try to kind of build a relationship. They have their own kind of vibrant ecosystem there. So we didn't necessarily see that we would be immediately kind of plug and play competitive. Like we would need to do some adaptations, and we thought that we would focus on the markets that we still can conquer without so many changes. So it's more of a question of focus and bandwidth and timing. And I think for the timing to help accelerate, we're tapping into some of the philanthropic funding to accelerate the entrance of our type of technology into that market. So certainly more than is on the radar. It's happening. It's just kind of happening, you can say, in the background compared to some of the things that are in the foreground.
It goes to a big area of mine. When we first met, I wasn't climate focused. It wasn't until I moved to the US until I really saw the size of that problem and got even slightly close to it. But the way the whole world perceives it has changed dramatically since you started Fireside Regrow. That has changed. Has that changed your value proposition and how you approach your business? Has it changed the way you think about going to get customers and growth? Like, can you tell us a bit about that? And did you go, it's about time? You could have said that. That would have been completely okay.
I think I said that in the boardroom a couple of times because when you're looking back at the 6 years and you're like, I told you. It's a good thing that you can say, okay, we were, paddling in the right direction, and that wave did come and pick us up, and it wasn't all completely absorbed. I couldn't have predicted that. Like, that's not about prediction. Of course, I had my ambition and projection, and it's true that the company delivered and realized to that projection, but I didn't know what forces would accelerate things so that whatever I drew on the whiteboard in Sydney 4 years ago would come true. Like, that's not that wasn't necessarily out of the understanding. It was out of the sheer passion and ambition. That's kind of how I thought and approached it. In terms of changing the go-to-market and changing the approach of like positioning the value proposition, for sure, definitely. Hence the two acquisitions, especially the last one that has added to agronomic decision support, that ecosystem outcomes computation. So you can do both in one. So you can not only understand what farmers need to do to manage their crop for yield, but what they need to do to manage the crop for environmental impacts and the yield. So for long-term resilience of the environment. And I think that was the key piece that we've discovered later on. It's not like we knew it was around and it was there for pickup. Again, one of the board connections to another investor who knew that company was looking for a CEO connected us, and we actually explored the opportunity to the point where it was clear to both sides that we should combine and make one business out of it. That moved the value proposition very dramatically forward. And I think we would have built ourselves probably up to 75-80% of that solution, but there's still some exclusive commercializable IP that was only available through that type of partnership. So I think this was a natural step for us, and out of my head, but everyone else was pretty freaked out. And it's like, okay, it's another acquisition. What are we doing? How are we going to monetize it? And where is the certainty that our leap of faith into pushing the business model downstream is going to actually see a return for that big investment? And acquisitions and combinations that are difficult from the technology and people perspective. So it's not easy. There's a lot of risk involved in it not working. So the fact that it did work, I want to just express the gratitude to the team and investors for that faith in that vision and the fact that we collectively are able to kind of realize it. But it was a very significant evolution in the business model, even if the tool and the action is very similar. But if you can quantify additional benefits and that enables you to access a completely different business model, you're in a different business. And we're building off of that, on top of that, and on top of that. And so it was a big exploration. Started with the same problem though, and still I'm on it.
That's awesome. There's a really great technical question here from William, which may require him to take it offline and could be a possible hire for you, I'm guessing. But William, did you want to ask on mic and ask that question, or you want me to paraphrase?
Hear that question.
Yeah.
If anyone wants to just like look in the chat and see Will's question. Basically, I just want to clarify that we're not seeing into the soil in like the direct remote sensing perspective. We actually model the soil. We only see things that are nearly visible to a human eye or will at some point be visible to a human eye. That's kind of the way to think about it. So we're using remote sensing as a proxy for collecting a lot of information from the farmers themselves and from their tractors. So like that's the best use of remote sensing. And as a remote sensing PhD, I have tried to do a lot with this tool and discovered that that's the best use of it for kind of input information into the model, rather than the output. So if you want to understand the soil properties, you can image some of it, but most of it we actually model with a biogeochemical model that we initialize and then constrain, calibrate, validate. We do some spot soil sampling to actually test for those parameters and use them again as a constraint on the model. So I would encourage anybody to be, quite inquisitive if they're hearing that someone is seeing soil carbon, a meter down, because as someone who would love to find a method like that, I still haven't found it. So if you hear it from anybody, please let them share it with Regrow.
Anastasia's still curious about solving the problem, so that tells you where she is on that journey. That's never going to go away. I think that is a sign of a good founder. And someone asked me about that the other day. It's like if you can care about the problem for a very, very long period of time, then that is a big call, because there are so many changes. As you said, the whole world has changed around this, and your business has changed multiple times, not just the name. And one thing again is that Anastasia was so focused on growing it that she wasn't trying to be acquired. She was acquiring other companies. Like, you're just focusing on finding ways to keep moving forward. So you mentioned you've had some challenges and there's some few things you've done wrong. Is there any either classical tips or funny stories about things you did wrong that you want to give people advice to avoid?
I think since the topic is scaling to the US, I think the don'ts on launching and scaling in the US is like, don't outsource it. Like, this is the first biggest one. Don't outsource this work. Like, if you haven't done it, and if you can't predict exactly how it's going to happen because you've done it, it's going to fail if you're going to outsource it. So like, you need to do that, what doesn't scale, yourself. So that's going to be my first one. I think don't be afraid of failing hiring. Like, that's the other thing. There's like, everyone says, oh yeah, can't you hire this person to be a GM in this new geography and you're off to the races because they have the networks? Like, yeah, sure, this big GM from this big company definitely has the chops to operate in my 10 people startup. Like, that's not happening. And so how do you actually triangulate to that? And often the advice you get on hiring sounds a lot easier than it's applied. So I think to Mick's earlier questions, like, how do you differentiate? I think I really bring to the table the experience that we had. And whenever we get this kind of more generic advice that I'm sure it's well-intentioned and most of the time works for us, but sometimes it doesn't. And there I actually share, it's like, look, remember last time we discussed something like this? This is how it ended up. I don't necessarily feel like this is very different. So let's not go there. And it's like, let's design a couple of experiments that could help us get to this in a little bit more informed way. So if you are indeed trying to figure out the hiring, for your first hire, if you landed in the US, tried a few things, you need a contact here, you need someone to keep continuing the conversation here between US and Australia. Do look for people. There's a lot of people who would consult or part-time would support, but I think if you really want to be successful, I think do not pretend that you commit to it. Like that's my third do not. Like do not say this is important unless it's important, because then people will keep you accountable to it. And I love that. So I actually say what is important so that I can tell everybody how I went with trying to achieve that, if I did or if I failed. So I think if this is truly important for you, you will have all the advisors and others helping you, but that could also mean that you need to commit to some time here, whether it's, I was doing 3 months, then I shifted to kind of 6 months, but it was back and forth between the US and Australia, but I did commit to like one slot of 3 months time to kind of try to close the customers during the peak sales season. So do not outsource, do not be afraid to fail hiring, and do not fake commit, just commit if you really.
Yeah, it's really great advice. I think it's, I think especially there's potentially introverted entrepreneurs, or there's highly technical entrepreneurs, and maybe they've never launched business in the US. I think outsourcing the sales, certainly, and customer relationships and hiring and investor relationships, it's just one of the many things you need to do. So I think that's I think you have done that in spades over the many years. And you put your head. The other thing I'll say, Anastasia is one of the busiest, hardworking founders I've ever met, but she also always puts her hand up to work with female founders, new founders, climate salad. She's helped me out multiple times. Interviewed her for my book, so she's been wonderful. So Anastasia, thank you for sharing so much. Really appreciate it. If there's anything we can do to help you continue your amazing journey for high impact, please let us know. Hopefully I'll get to the US some point in the next 6 months, and maybe able to see you and buy you that coffee I owe you. And but keep going, keep growing, and thank you so much for sharing so much with us and the audience today.
Thank you so much for having me, and I hope folks can apply it. It'll apply some of this advice, and hopefully some of the things that I said resonated. If there's more kind of particular specific advice you want to chat about, I mean, Mick's probably more appropriate, but if my kind of more specific point of view is relevant, then I'm happy to connect on LinkedIn, and please do reach out. I'm always happy to support and kind of guide. Can't afford a lot of time, but can offer an opinion. So you get what you ask for.
One line from Anastasia can be very valuable, I guarantee you that. So so many gems in there. Glad we're recording it. Again, a really huge shout out to Charlotte and Lacia from New South Wales government for the support in this program. It is really important that we accelerate these climate tech opportunities and take them global. Australia is a big country, but a small market, and whatever we can do to raise your ambitions up, we will do that. So again, Anastasia, I'll pass it back to Charlotte and Lacia, but thank you everybody for attending, and hope you got some good value.
Thank you so much for this wonderful fireside chat. I know we didn't get a chance to do a whole lot of questions, but the chat is absolutely exploding with thank yous. That was such a great session to dive deep into your brain there, Dr. Anastasia. So thank you so much. Please do reach out on LinkedIn, and thank you so much for being part of our third webinar in the Investment New South Wales series. Our next one will be in 2 weeks, and by the looks of the survey, it will be focusing on Europe and the UK. So thank you so much, everyone.